What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to Celio's Network for my very first meta snapshot video for the Silver Tempest format in December 2022 for the Pokemon TCG. The goals of this meta snapshot is to inform the viewer of a myriad of deck archetypes currently being played at standard format events, encourage creativity and diversity of deck choices by showing examples of just how diverse this meta is and how many decks have a shot at succeeding, and also concise and clear explanations of each deck's categorization. So I'm not going to be spending too much time on any single deck or archetype, so feel free to pause the video to look at deck lists or look at my explanations of any of the archetypes that we're looking at today. Be sure to subscribe to this channel for daily Pokemon TCG content, and also check out my wonderful sponsors and affiliates, Dragon Shield Sleeves, Beast Coast Pokemon, PoTownStore.com, and PokemonCard.io. So in this meta snapshot, we will be looking at four main categories of decks. Tier 0, which any deck in here is going to be very popular, very successful, and very adaptable by my standards. Tier 1 will be popular, successful, and adaptable. The counter meta will explain later exactly what causes me to categorize a deck into the counter meta. And then, of course, we have all of the other decks that are existing in the standard format right now. Beginning with Tier 0, this is going to be just Lugia VSTAR up here in Tier 0. The metagame currently is centralized around Lugia VSTAR. That means players are expecting to play against many Lugia VSTARs. They're trying to prepare their decks for it, or maybe they're even preparing their decks only for Lugia VSTAR, just specifically trying to beat this one deck. Lugia VSTAR is very popular, and it's also very strong, and the skill floor, the level of entry to play the deck, is low enough that players of all skill levels or most skill levels can reasonably pilot it. Here is a list that John Ang, Isaiah Bradner, and Reagan Retzloff all played to high placements at the Latin American International Championships. And then we have a bit of an updated list from Isaiah Bradner for his top 8 finish in Toronto Regionals. This one including the 1/1 line of Espeon VMAX to protect your Pokemon with energy attached to them from effects of attacks like Yveltal Amazing Rare, and the paralysis effects on Zekrom and Articuno, which are some cards that we'll talk about a little bit later. Going into Tier 1, these archetypes exist in the higher echelons of competitive viability, regardless of Tier 0 and the counter meta. These decks can adapt, typically, and if the decks are not able to adapt, then they'll probably fall out of Tier 1. Lost Zone decks, there are generally 3 categories of: those with Radiant Greninja, those with Radiant Charizard, and those with Giratina V-Star. That is how I categorize the Lost Zone archetype in my mind, and we're going to depict it on the next slide. So this is the Lost Zone box archetype. It may look like a lot, but we're going to break it down. The Lost Zone box archetype is going to always include Comfey and Colress's Experiment, and typically Sableye, Cramorant as a backup attacker. These are some of the staples of the deck. If we go into the Radiant Charizard variant of the Lost Zone box archetype, this variant will typically not include Mirage Gates and be heavily focused on Cramorant and Sableye as attackers, as you'll see here in Pedro Torres' 46th place from the Latin American International Championships. He used 3 Sableyes, 2 Cramorant, Radiant Charizard. The deck is playing 3 Clara so that you can cycle those attackers back into your hand and replay them down, and keep attacking with these very, very strong single prize Pokemon. The Radiant Greninja variant will typically include Mirage Gates and a myriad of tech attackers, including but not limited to Kyogre from Celebrations, Amazing Rare Raikou from Vivid Voltage, Zeraora from Vivid Voltage, and Snorlax from Lost Origin. As you'll see, many of those cards I just mentioned featured in this list that Caleb Gedimer and Grant Manley both used to top 8 Toronto Regionals, using that Zekrom with the Wild Shock that can paralyze Pokemon. So against a Lugia V-Star, it's very strong because you'll be hitting for weakness and paralyzing them, and at this time, most Lugia decks were not playing a way around the paralysis effect. And the last one will be the Giratina V-Star variants. These are going to resemble the Greninja variants, but they have to cut some cards out to add an extra focus on Giratina V and Giratina V-Star. This is the first place Juniors Division Toronto Regionals list, piloted by Johan, and this is Giratina V-Star variant of the Lost Zone box deck. So you'll see that there are similarities here between the Radiant Greninja and the Giratina variants, and then the Radiant Charizard variant is much different than the other two typically. Going into Mew VMAX, Mew VMAX is a consistent and powerful archetype. The two variants of Mew VMAX differ based on the inclusion of Fusion Strike energy. Here we have the variant without Fusion Strike energy, piloted by Ryan Antonucci to a 12th place finish at the Latin American International Championships. This is only using double turbo energy to attack with Cross Fusion Strike from Mew VMAX to copy Technoblast, and sometimes will copy a Psychic Leap from a benched Mew V or a Max Miracle from a benched Mew VMAX. The other variant of Mew VMAX, of course, is including 4 Fusion Strike energies and the very powerful Mellow Edda that uses those Fusion Strike energies to do up to 280 damage prior to any power tablets or choice belts. And you can start hitting with this Mellow Edda on turn 1 thanks to Alessa Sparkle, which makes this a little bit more of an aggressive and a little bit more of a high rolly variant of Mew VMAX. PALKIA INTELEON's the last tier 1 deck we'll talk about, and PALKIA INTELEON was the best deck in Standard for quite a while, and best decks rarely just fall off because of a new best deck in the format, and I really try to drive that point home because this happens all the time. People thought PALKIA INTELEON was just no longer a playable deck, and of course we have somebody who tested the format and innovated enough. Jake Gearhart got top 8 at Toronto Regionals with PALKIA INTELEON, of course using that Articuno with Wild Freeze combined with the Emergency Jelly to really drive home the Lugia V-Star matchup into being even somewhat favorable. Jake Gearhart, for the winning into top 8, beat Rahul Reddy, who was playing Espeon VMAX, which is a counter to the paralysis strategies, but Jake Gearhart was still able to win with PALKIA INTELEON, because PALKIA INTELEON is a strong, consistent deck. It can fetch out whatever cards you need out of the deck because of Drizzile and Inteleon. So I don't think this is a deck that should have ever been written off, and Jake Gearhart showed that in Toronto Regionals. On to the counter meta. The counter meta forms around the centralized meta. In this case, the counter meta formed around the Lugia V-Star, while also taking into account some of the tier 1 archetypes like Mew and Lost Zone. Now, these counter meta decks can sometimes become solidified as a deck outside of the counter meta. They can become an actual tier 1 deck or a tier 2 deck. Every deck kind of starts out as a new creation. Just about every deck, except for the ones that are kind of forced by TPCI because they're on the pack art and they print all the support, just about every deck outside of those start out as some sort of counter deck or rogue deck or creative deck, and then they come to fruition and become their own meta deck. So a lot of decks enter this counter meta category, and few decks come out of it as their own deck. So FROSMOTH box here by Tim Franklin won the first place regionals got first place at the regionals in Brisbane, Brisbane, Australia, using some attackers like the Articuno Wild Freeze, which we've mentioned several times already, the Radiant Greninja with Moonlight Shuriken, the Alolan Vulpix V-Star, which has a free attack that can do a lot of damage if your opponent has a lot of V Pokemon on the board, and it also has an attack that does 160 and then prevents damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from Pokemon that have abilities on them. It also has Ice Cube Block Face, which can just auto-win against the Regigigas deck. FLAAFFY box, I do think FLAAFFY box is just generally a worse FROSMOTH box, but this got second to FROSMOTH box. I don't expect to see this one as much, but this was a deck that formed in the counter meta. Lightning types, paralysis, just really good into the Lugia V-Star decks that they expected to hit, and it looks like they did because they got second place at this regionals. VIKA PALKIA. This actually won a 700 person regionals, piloted by Matus, and I won't say Matus's last name because I don't think I will do it any good. But first place regionals in Stuttgart, won by the VIKA PALKIA deck. I have some gameplay on the channel with this deck if you'd like to check it out. I also have some gameplay with the FROSMOTH box deck I should have mentioned, but I really like this deck. I like that it offers tempo strategies in the early game to just do some poke damage while item locking, and then you have the powerful burst potential of PALKIA V-STAR's V-STAR power that tosses a bunch of energy onto the board. And we have control. We'll actually show two control lists here for those control lovers. We don't always have control being viable in the format, so let's celebrate it while it is. Piper Lapine won Toronto Regionals with Mewtwo V Union Yveltal Control. Mewtwo V Union is such a great card because it can heal itself for 200 damage. It can do 300 damage with no drawbacks. Its ability means that it is unaffected by effects of attacks like Giratina V-STAR Star Requiem, and then you can also do Cysplosion to spread 16 damage counters on your opponent's board however you like, and it has 310 HP, so it's very, very strong. Another version of Mewtwo V Union Control was played by Sander Wojcik at the 6th place regionals, at the Stuttgart regionals, where he placed 6th place. And he actually used the Gengar here that allows you to move your damage counters around the board from one of your Psychic Pokemon to another Psychic Pokemon, also using Shadow Rider Calyrex V for its Shadow Mist attack that blocks your opponents from playing stadiums down. And then, and also tool cards, or no, I'm sorry, special energies in stadium, so it can just completely lock out a double turbo energy focused Mew VMAX deck. And then using Kirlia's Refinement as a draw engine, and Gardevoir's Shining Arcana as some extra energy acceleration. Arceus Duraludon got 2nd place at Toronto Regionals, and I was on the fence about calling this a Tier 1 deck or counter meta deck, but I do think it just really fits the counter meta category better than Tier 1. But definitely let me know what you guys think about all of my categorizations and explanations of these decks down below. I'd love to start some discussion on that. I think Arceus Duraludon's a really, really solid deck because of how the format has formed right now. Hence, I think it's in the counter meta. Other decks, they aren't the best and they aren't the worst. These decks exist in the meta and shouldn't be a surprise to see, but they aren't nearly as popular as Tier 0 and Tier 1. We've got Regigigas. This won the Champions League Kyoto, piloted by Yuta Tagami. This was almost a 3,000 person event, so winning that is huge. And this deck winning that event shows just how strong and consistent it can be over the course of a really long and really grueling event. Regigigas is really good because it has a bunch of types you can hit for weakness. And it's also a single price focused deck, so you're going to outtrade decks that are too focused on V-STAR, VMAX, V-Unions. KYUREM VMAX, I think KYUREM VMAX is a really nice, just solid deck that's also pretty easy to pilot. It doesn't do anything crazy, it doesn't have any great matchups, but its matchups also aren't awful. It's very mediocrely placed in terms of matchup spreads, but it's pretty easy to play. I think it's kind of fun to play because of the high damage output that KYUREM VMAX has and the overall burst potential, and also the ability to tech cards like Empoleon V and Ice Q into the deck if you so choose to. And we have PIKA here. This got 2nd place back in Salt Lake City prior to Silver Tempest, but I think PIKA still has some reason to be played in the current standard format as well, even with Silver Tempest out here. So I wouldn't be surprised to see this popping up at a little bit more of tournaments than it did at the first few events for Silver Tempest legal events. And then there's even more decks. We would be here all day if I talked about every single deck that's playable in standard format, but here on the screen I just wanted to flash a few cards that represent some decks that you might see. Eternatus VMAX just got top 4 at the Kyoto Champions League. Galarian Weezing was played as a control variant at Toronto Regionals. Blissey Miltank is always around, and we even have players using heavier counts of the Evil Tall with Cry of Destruction in their Blissey decks right now. Durant got top 4 at the Brisbane Regionals, I believe. Aerodactyl VSTAR was played in some Arceus box decks at Toronto. And Azul GG has some gameplay of that if you want to check it out. Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX has also been played in combination with Arceus VSTAR. Beedrill has been played in combination with Arceus and also just in INTELEON single prize decks. Hisuian Zoric VSTAR, I think it's kind of fallen off, but it's still the same old beat stick that it has been. Zoroark box has some good matchups in the metagame, but also hates playing against Lost Box decks, which is the reason why I think Zoroark has been kept down for now. And then also Hisuian Goodra VSTAR. It won Salt Lake City Regionals back in the Lost Origin format, so we'll have to see if anybody can make some strides with it in the Silver Tempest format, but Lugia is such a bad matchup for it. So that's my meta snapshot for December 2022 in the Silver Tempest standard format. Let me know what you think about this type of video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time here on Celio's Network.